Hello and welcome to the State Secrets podcast brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you to check out the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner. I really hope you can join us for this black tie celebration of the national security community. It's happening on Friday, April 18th in Washington, D.C. You can find out more at cipherbriefhonors.com. This week, we're talking about why we're still at war with Russia. And when I say we, it's not just the United States, it's our Western allies as well. Despite efforts by U.S. President Donald Trump to warm U.S. relations with Moscow amid negotiations for Russia to end its war in Ukraine, Russian sabotage operations, active measures, and gray zone activities are continuing around the world. Now, Moscow has mastered the art of engaging in operations that push right up to the edge of war without really crossing that line. Or have they? Welcome back to the Cipher Brief studio and to the State Secrets podcast. It is my pleasure to welcome two deeply experienced guests to talk today about Russian sabotage efforts, about gray zone, about Russia, what Russia has done historically when it comes to clandestine interference operations, particularly in Western societies. And joining me to discuss this is Nick Fishwick. Nick is a former senior member of the British Foreign Office and a Cipher Brief expert. And Dave Pitts. Dave is a former senior member of the Central Intelligence Agency here in the U.S. and also a Cipher Brief expert. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
You know, this is something that we're seeing in the news. Sometimes we understand straight away when Russian sabotage or gray zone type efforts are involved. And Dave, you're going to speak a little bit to kind of defining what gray zone activities are. Why don't we just start there? Do you want to we've worked through this group at the Cipher Brief that you are a leading member of on gray zone operations. How would you define gray zone operations versus more generic sabotage or clandestine interference?
Sure. I think I would define the gray zone as that geopolitical space between peace and war, where nations work to advance their national interest, but to also undermine the national interests of their adversaries and even set the conditions for future war, all without triggering a military response. So we just see that more and more today. There's so many examples of that. Nations can calculate that if they stay under the threshold of triggering a military response, they can do a lot of damage to their adversaries and to advance their own national interest.
Yeah. And we're seeing, I think the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. just released a report recently on Russia escalating sabotage to pressure the U.S. and allies on Ukraine. So these kinds of operations are used for various reasons. Nick, Russia has a long history of activities inside the UK of clandestine Russian interference. Talk a little bit about how this has changed over the years, if you will, maybe even with some examples of times when you've seen this.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is kind of as Dave indicated there, gray zone is basically war. And the point I've been trying to make for probably the last 2 or 3 years, perhaps since the brutal and illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, that war is now happening across the world in different forms from which people of my generation expected it to. So you go back to the, glorious days of the Cold War when we just happened to wake up every morning expecting nuclear Armageddon could happen. And that was the case. It was either that or nothing in the 80s and the 70s when I was a youngster, whereas now it's not that. I may well regret saying this one day, but I don't think nuclear war is likely. So it's possible tactical nuclear weapons might be used. Again, very unlikely. I can't imagine a full-blown nuclear war happening. I think it's less likely that will happen than it would have been in the Cold War days. But bad actor states, and the Russians are right up there with the very worst of them. And as far as we in the UK are concerned, the most threatening to us. they've got a whole range of things that they can use, which are still, it's not diplomacy, it's not peaceful action, it's illegal, belligerent activities designed to undermine our security, our ability to stand up for our values. So we're seeing, for example, my sense is that the Russian secret services before, in the Soviet Union time, before 1991, although they definitely did do active things like supporting propaganda, like trying to influence states and so on, a big part of their core mission was simply espionage. It seems to me now that the Russian special services, and we've seen the rise of the GRU as an actor in this, particularly over the last 15 to 20 years, in a way they weren't active before, or weren't as prominent or as notorious as they are now, actively embracing active measures, killing people, sabotaging things, and interfering with elections, doing things online to influence opinion, and so on and so on. And so you talk about examples. Well, examples in my country will go right back almost 20 years to the murder of Litvinenko, and then they go less far back, but carrying on from there to 2018, when there was an attempt by the GRU under the most ridiculous cover possible, with the most pathetic tradecraft imaginable. They tried to murder a former GRU colleague called Skripal, and they inadvertently murdered a completely innocent British woman at the same time. Absolutely classic examples of activity, and I would say that's basically acting as a country at war with us. Now, just if I can just jump ahead into what seems to me what's going on geopolitically, and perhaps to provide a bit of the framing for what Dave's going to say, and I'm sure Dave's got his own framing for this. I think what's happening that I can see at the moment is the Russians are thinking we can persuade this US administration to do a deal with us, and we can get the Americans out of our way in Europe, and we can focus on a form of power, regional power conflict in Europe that we've not had the luxury of enjoying before. They weren't powerful or Western leaning enough to do it before the First World War, and after the Second World War they were too held back by the power of the United States as the underpinning force in NATO. If the United States ceases to be the underpinning force in NATO and Europe, so as we've talked about before, Europe is having to protect itself, the Russians think, well, that gives us lots of opportunities, bring it on, that's what we want. So I think their game is to get the Americans out of their space and go back to a kind of regional European power rivalry, in which, because at the moment they've got superior forces, they think they can win that game.
Dave, what's your perspective on that? And you've talked before about, things have really changed, obviously, since the full-scale Russian war in Ukraine in 2022. How do you see Russia's intentions when it comes to what Nick just talked about, and when it comes to using more of these gray zone or hybrid, as some people also call them, activities?
I appreciate Nick's comments, and I wanted to say something that he sort of framed. But the first is, great power competition is intensifying. We see it. There's more threats. I'll just speak for the United States, more threats against the United States than at any time, maybe in our history. And look at the rise of China. Look at Russia's aggression around the globe. Look at the surrogate role that Iran and North Korea plays to enhance those. And then you have all these regional powers, aspiring powers that are emerging and rising with ambitions. And you got proxy wars and proxies, and even global terrorism, all really complicates where we are. So great power competition is intensifying. But more so than ever, great powers want to avoid a war with another great power. I mean, history teaches some brutal lessons. Go back and look at World War II, about those countries and the militaries that were defeated. It was brutal for decades. And I think if you look at what's going on with Russia, in Ukraine, if we use the numbers provided by Ukraine, Russia has lost the equivalent of what would be one of the world's largest militaries, right? And it's lost a massive amount of national power. So great power warfare has significant consequences. So great powers want to avoid that. Where does that leave us? That leaves us squarely in the gray zone, right? Where countries try to advance their national interest and achieve maybe the same outcome they could from a conventional war without taking all that risk. That's why I think we're seeing more gray zone activity. We probably are likely to see more as it continues. And let me say a little bit about what's going on with the negotiations. That what's going on is great power competition, right? This is not a negotiation among several countries that are trying to bring the end to a war, right? Russia has the same objectives through these negotiations that it had 3 years ago when it invaded Ukraine. It still wants to control Ukraine's political future, undermine and weaken NATO, and ensure Ukraine never becomes a NATO country, and fracture the relationship between NATO and the United States. It is still working to achieve that. And if the war in Ukraine were simply like if this were just a sort of a border conflict that escalated, then you could more quickly get both sides together to form some sort of common cause sort of to end the war. And when we see Russia refusing to engage in a real ceasefire, and we see it continue to try to shape and influence the negotiations with its red lines and demands for concessions, it's clear what Putin's goals are. I would say we should not expect Russia to try to change its objectives now just because we're asking it to come to the table based on what they've endured for 3 years. If you think about their losses and what they've suffered through for 3 years, we shouldn't expect them to change their goals now.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
I think that's a reasonable assumption based on what we've seen so far. And then we also really have not seen any fruit of these efforts for the negotiations when it comes to what Russia may be willing to give up to end the war in Ukraine either. So as those talks continue, Nick, let me ask you, that there's a history of Russian bad behavior in the UK as well, which you noted a couple of things. One, the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal. Usually when these things happen in the past, you've had some Russian officials kicked out of the country, labeled persona non grata, not able to return. I wonder, do you think that those types of measures as a response to this kind of bad behavior or sabotage or active measures are going to work in the future? Or do particularly these Western countries who are dealing with these types of activities have to change the way they're thinking about these operations and change the response to get a different outcome?
Yeah, well, as far as I can see, they are changing their response. And, here in the UK, our own domestic security service, MI5, is trying to adjust the way it responds to a changing threat picture. What does that mean? It means that, 40 or 50 years ago, MI5 would have had teams of people following every known and suspected intelligence officer, probably of the then KGB, around London. And if a KGB officer wanted to, in fact, I think any Soviet diplomat wanted to travel more than 25 miles away from the centre of London, I mean, why they want to do that, I don't know. But, I mean, they would have to get special permission to do it. I don't know whether they have to get special permission or not, but it doesn't really matter because the Russians, they are not stupid, and they're not thinking, oh, well, we'll just use the people that are most likely to be identified by MI5 to give MI5 a sporting chance of stopping us. They're not thinking that. They're thinking, we'll use criminal organizations, we'll use nationalities which aren't Russian. They aren't even British. They might be Bulgarian. There's been a lot of publicity recently about the Russian use of Bulgarians. I mean, it's a classic ploy. Bulgaria, unfortunately, has a relatively close historic relationship with Russia going well back before 1917. So it's probably relatively easy for them to recruit people. And unfortunately, Bulgaria has had a problem with organised crime even since it's been in the European Union. So they're going to use people like that, organisations like that, groups like that, people who aren't obvious MI5 targets, who know how to commit sabotage in a way that, maybe an intelligence officer pretending to be a first secretary in the embassy wouldn't know how to conduct sabotage operations, or plan a murder, or plan a car accident, or plan whatever illegal activity they're planning to do. So I think that's probably the way they're doing it. I do think that MI5 will be aware of this and will be monitoring it, but it makes it much harder to monitor.
Mm-hmm. Dave, this is similar. I mean, we've seen a lot of measures too, not quite the active measures that Nick's referring to, but maybe more that would fall into that gray zone space. Like in Finland, we've seen ships, cables, undersea communications cables that are really crucial to Europe, to the United States, severed. There's all sorts of activities going on. And if you want a good rundown of them, all you have to do is read the open source report each day in the Cipher Brief, because there are probably 4 or 5 things in there that might be some sort of gray zone or clandestine activities. But what do you think in terms of the response to this? If you're now fighting a different kind of war, which you mentioned, how might you think about responding in a different way to try to create some deterrence around these activities?
Yeah, and Suzanne, if I could, can I just go back a little bit and layer on a bit more of this, if that's all right?
Of course.
So
yeah.
Certainly we see activity by Russia in the gray zone. And one of the things our adversaries want to do in the gray zone is sort of win that cognitive battle, right? Win that cognitive space. And there's some things we're seeing Russia do there. First, I think what they really are trying to do is control the narrative, And some of this goes back to 3 years ago. And we've heard this, but it gets repeated so much that it starts to get picked up as fact. And that is, Ukraine is not a real country, right? Ukraine is corrupt. Ukraine is run by Nazis. Ukraine is suppressing Russian-speaking citizens. Ukraine is responsible for the invasion. We've heard all of that. That's part of the narrative. I think Putin also wants to make his red lines become sort of normal, routine conversation. He wants to normalize them. Things like the need for territorial concessions, which means Ukraine's got to give up territory. No NATO for Ukraine. The need for elections in Ukraine. Ukraine can't resupply or reposition its troops if there's going to be a ceasefire. The 4 territories are actually Russian territory all along, and the Russian-speaking Ukrainians there really want to be Russian citizens. The other part of their narrative is Russia is strong and can't be defeated, right? The outcome is inevitable of this war. Why are we still fighting it? And then I think one part of this narrative that Russia didn't see a year ago that it sees today is Russia is better as a partner to the United States than an adversary. And that is something they are certainly added to the narrative now. I also think they want to exploit the desire for an agreement. Russia believes we want this agreement more than they do. So Russia is willing to accelerate attacks, more destruction, more death, to create a sense of urgency for that deal. And Russia thinks if that sense of urgency means outcomes favorable to them. And I do think Russia is willing to give small wins to make it look like they're approaching this in a sincere way. We've already seen the agreement for no strikes on energy infrastructure, although that hasn't held up. Maybe a discussion about, an agreement on the Black Sea. Both of those, by the way, really favor Russia because of what Ukraine's been able to do there. But prisoner releases or the promise of release of Ukraine children, those are all really easy wins that Russia could do, and they still don't have to make any major concessions. And of course, as Nick has mentioned, and we talked about, they will still use coercion, intimidation, and fear to achieve its goals. That's everything from sabotage and arson, assassination plots, attacks on undersea gas pipelines, communications cables. I think there's been probably, from a sabotage perspective, sabotage operations by Russia in 15 different countries since the invasion of Ukraine. And even some claims by Finland that Russia is using forced migration as a weapon. Of course, we know this, they will continue to try to undermine NATO. And I think one of their plans is try to stoke this common distrust that they see in our current administration against NATO, and to sort of try to identify as that sort of a common ground. And one thing that Russia's been doing for decades, as Nick knows, political coercion and interference in political elections and political processes across NATO. If they can They don't have to move countries closer to them. They just have to move countries farther away from supporting Ukraine. So I think that's some of the things we're seeing now. And I tell you, Suzanne, the thing about the gray zone is it's hard to respond, right? Because escalation, as we know, is a ladder. Our own country, countries in Europe sometimes don't know how to respond. Certainly, if a country has plausible deniability, countries are hesitating to respond to those things. But in some cases, we're afraid that if we take the next step, we're going to escalate to something bigger that gets out of control. I think one of the things you do see cooperation between the United States and NATO on countering the cutting of undersea cables. It took a while to get to that. There are some modest efforts underway. I certainly think the intelligence sharing that's going on is a big deal. I don't see it, but I know it's going on so that we better understand what our adversaries are doing, particularly Russia in the gray zone. There was a disruption of that assassination plot in Germany, which was based on good intelligence and good intelligence sharing. I think some of the things we need to do are underway and are being modestly effective. But sort of that is the calculation of the gray zone. Russia knows it can do things, and we're not going to respond just because of a number of circumstances, so it feels free to continue to do those.
Let's address the elephant in the room, which, of course, the Trump administration has a very different approach to Russia than that of the Biden administration. And the Biden administration, many, even critics would say, had too much fear. They were risk averse. They didn't apply enough pressure at the right times as needed to be able to stop Russian activities, particularly in Ukraine. Reuters is now reporting that the National Security Council under the new Trump administration is no longer holding regular meetings with European officials on Russian sabotage efforts. You hear the president, has spoken himself in almost really warm terms about Vladimir Putin. How much of an impact or a chill does this put on intelligence sharing if the rest of the world doesn't share President Trump's views of Putin and how much he might be willing to actually make a deal and be a trusted partner?
It's not for me to, although everybody else is doing it, but I don't particularly want to sound off about American politics. The American people voted clearly in November and they got the president they wanted. So that's democracy. I would, however, say a couple of things. One is I can't think of an example in history where a country, a great power, has withdrawn into isolation and survived. I've never come across a case of that actually happening. So I think, those who might be cancelling America to go isolationist now might want to think about how this is going to turn out in the long term. The second thing is, there's a kind of what used to be a conservative view that politics is about realpolitik and power, and it's not about values. And, Dr. Kissinger used to talk about Metternich, who was supposedly the great cynical leader, senior minister in Austria in the early part of the 19th century. Metternich was supposed to be a great example of a guy who didn't operate according to values and morals. He operated according to his empire's interests. I think the trouble with that is that when you get into what's happening now, you are going to find yourself exactly in the first case that I'm talking about, isolationist. If the actions of the American administration are to pick fights with Canada and Greenland and to start being really friendly with Russia, not only is it going to confuse everybody, it's going to make everybody think, the one thing you want with a partner, a senior partner, is reliability, and that's now gone. And I don't think America's going to find a new form of reliability in Putin. It's an inherently unstable regime, and it's a cynical and murderous regime. And even if you wanted to have a relationship just based on interests, and all that, those business interests and geostrategic interests from leaving Europe for Putin to worry about and America doesn't need to anymore, that's not going to work, not least because Europe is, as I've said before, possibly on speaking to you, Europe is a powerful economic player, and it's powerful in terms of American interests. And America will be silly to let that just become consumed by wasting all its resources in a rivalry with Russia. Clearly, we've got to do that to some extent, or to be dominated, by an incompetent and corrupt and therefore wasteful and inefficient and technologically more backward state like Russia. I can't see how that's actually going to be in America's medium-term interest, forget about long-term interest. So I guess there's something about the way this game seems to be played where I think the realpolitik approach, the kind of, this idea that Trump only understands he understands geoeconomics, he doesn't understand geopolitics. Well, I think that will collapse of its own internal contradictions, to use a famous catchphrase that somebody once popularized.
Let me ask though, will there be an immediate impact, do you think, on sort of the chilling of not relations? That's too deep of a question, but the chilling of the willingness of allied partners. Let's take the Five Eyes organization as a perfect example. Will there be a pulling back of intelligence sharing if all parties aren't equally trusted?
Yeah, and can I go back and just comment a little bit? I'll do both if that's okay, to comment a little bit on Nick's response. I think what we're seeing is we are underestimating, I think, Putin, his objectives, his commitment to his objectives, and the lengths he will go to get everything he wants in Ukraine and Europe, and to continue to undermine the United States. I mean, seriously, what Putin really wants is a strategic defeat of the United States. He hasn't given up on that, so he is still working on that as well. So I think we're underestimating Putin here, although a lot of experts on Putin and are speaking out about this, but it seems like going into this, we're underestimating him. I think we're also overestimating our ability to change his behavior, that there will be some things we could do, because we've already done a lot. I mean, I just talked earlier about the loss, this loss of their military and the loss of national power. Yet he has endured, he has persevered, he has stayed on course. While many, I think, thought along the way he might have to find an exit path somewhere, he hasn't. So I think we're overestimating our ability to influence Putin for the long run. And I would say to the other question, this is a challenge. And the relationships, and certainly Nick knows this, among the intelligence services, particularly those that work together all the time, is pretty strong, right? And what you hope is those relationships stay strong. But what I would say, those in services also work for their governments, right? And so if the political relationship gets a little frayed, there could be some pressure downward to not share, to slow down things in those among those intelligence services, because they are the service for their country, right? And so certainly they're influenced by what those relationships look like. I think it would be terrible and regrettable if that happens, right? Because one of the things that has been great for U.S. national security and the national security of our allies has been that very strong intelligence sharing, I think, which has really been a strong contributor, right, to the global order that we've enjoyed for 80 years. And so I hope that doesn't happen. I hope there can be continued close connections among those intelligence services. I think it's vital.
Yeah. Gentlemen, and this is such a big topic, and it's so easy to try to cover too much territory, maybe overcover one particular thing while missing bigger picture. But I just want to ask you both for kind of closing thoughts as we round this topic out. And as you're thinking about how Russia is using sabotage, how Russia is operating in the gray zone, the warming of relations, all of these things together, what are you going to be most looking for next as indicators that there might be more of an uh-oh moment? Dave, why don't you start us off this time?
Yeah, a couple things here. I think Putin thinks he sees a path to a win here. But we give Putin credit for, we give him too much credit for being smart. And he's smart on some things, but he's not on some other things. So Putin is completely capable of undermining his own plan here, because I think he's trying to calculate how far can he push the president, or how long can he sort of not agree with some of the things that the president is trying to get done. So that is the thing I'm watching. Are there some gaps and fractures there in that relationship that, and I think Putin is worried that he's going to come up on the wrong side of that. So I think that's one of the things I'm watching. The other thing I would say, though, Suzanne, in one of the gray zone articles I did, I said China's waging a gray war against the United States, and Russia is supporting it. And I do think, and this isn't new, we've had other people comment on this. I mean, China is playing its cards close to its chest. It's enabling Russia, done a lot to enable Russia. Minimal investment, minimal risk, but nonetheless is invested in the outcome of this. A Russia win is a China win, and I think China is watching very closely and is already adapting its strategy on how to engage against the United States and Taiwan, the South China Sea, and other parts of the world where that competition is playing out. So I think, as I said earlier, this is great power competition, so there'll be some long-term consequences as this plays out.
Yeah, I'm glad you both mentioned that too, the great power competition component to this, because it's never just Russia either. Nick, closing thoughts from you?
Well, I'd say don't panic. We've got to stay firm. I thought what Dave said about the intelligence relationship was 100% spot on. I think, it's worrying. And if it gets bad, then of course intelligence sharing will be affected. And the idea of one Five Eye country, effectively threatening another Five Eye country, I would not have expected that. Mm-hmm. But let's hope it's just a bit of silly rhetoric that's going to pass. So I'm hoping that the intelligence relationships will hold up, and it will take, you'll have to work very hard to undermine those relationships because they are very close and they go right the way through the different organizations. So let's not panic. Let's hope those relationships hold together, whatever the rhetoric at the top, but don't assume that, as I've said before. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. I would again say, I hope I never am exposed as having underrated Russia, but I think we overestimate them. I think, as Dave says, we overestimate how clever Putin is. I think we sometimes need to remind ourselves, what an unsuccessful country Russia is and how unsuccessful it's been, really, at least since 1917. The Russian Revolution didn't do the Soviet economy any good. And the story of the Russian economy since the fall of the Soviet Union has been very, very uneven since then now. So at the moment, it's an extremely low productivity country. It's not great in terms of technological creativity. Its GDP is tiny. Again, we don't need to panic about this. Even if the US backs off support for Europe, we can cope this if we're given the time to transition. So it's uneasy times. I wouldn't have expected some of the things to happen that seem to have happened, but let's not panic, and we can still win this one.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both so much for the conversation. Dave, you have one more thing to add.
Yeah,
I was reading your mind.
I'm inspired by Nick's comments. The deal isn't done until it's done. And so Putin might feel like he's in a good spot here, but again, this could go flying off the rails because he got the potential to do something dumb, which means all of a sudden there's greater pressure on Putin, and this thing could change. So I don't feel like the outcome is certain on these negotiations. Putin is completely unpredictable, and sometimes he works against his own interests. So I think there's still time, right? We've got some very smart people involved for this to work out to a solution that's good for Ukraine and good for our national security and the national security of our partners. There's still time.
So we'll all stay tuned to see what the next twist and turn will be, which I'm sure there will be one. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Nick Fishwick is former senior member of the British Foreign Office. Dave Pitts is former senior member of the CIA's clandestine service. Gentlemen, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Good seeing you, Nick.